I want to like film the filming.
It's
a big moment in my life.
First time.
So it's very different than the first filming.
Yeah.
Which was on our laptops.
Welcome to Human in the Loop, a series where we discuss what it takes to build and deploy real-world systems for the enterprise.
Hi, welcome to Human in the Loop. I'm Angela Kher.
I'm Danny Gorman.
I'm Emily Xue.
And today we're going to be talking about some public GenAI failures that made it to the headlines. But first, before we talk about that, I would love to start by discussing with you two the difference between those public headlines and what we see privately with enterprise examples. Danny, how do these stack up to private examples?
I would say that what we've seen internally is often a lot more extreme, I think because of the breadth and depth of testing that we do when we're testing an AI application. Yeah. But those don't make it to the headlines because we test it before it actually gets launched.
Yeah, that's actually in a lot of the security and privacy research is like that, right? So you do a lot more to actually provide the much thorough understanding about your system, about your application. But what actually eventually surface to the public is actually going to be just like a tip of the entire iceberg.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
That's great. Can you guys do you have a perspective on when like model capability increases? Does anything kind of change with the risks that you see?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question, actually. So think about how much effort like all the big labs actually spending in evaluating their model and put from a variety of perspectives, the basic capability, the reasoning, math, and agentic application. But very more importantly is the safetiness and RAI, the responsible AI property. A lot of time, a lot of talent actually spent on that. But still, when it comes into application development, especially enterprise real workflow application environment, we do see a lot of incidents. This is not the first news we see. There's quite a few there. So I think one of the problem really is there is a big difference from just study the model behavior towards the application behavior. Because the model gives the capabilities of building a much more richer capability to not just providing text as output, also like agent system, you're using tools, you have memories, you have access to your private data. All these enhanced capabilities actually enlarge the surface of security and safety analysis. So I don't know about kids, right? So if you think about baby, when they're first born, you put them in the crib.
They don't move. That's great.
Yes, the guardrail is simple. You got your house baby proof, and then they suddenly get to crawl and walk. Then the surface that you need to protect your house is much larger. And then now even mentioning if they're able to get to teenagers, they got their phone, they get into internet.
That's interesting.
We were just talking about this before we started filming. My tiny child toppled a small piece of furniture yesterday. And I was like, I really should have brought in those professionals to test our apartment for all of the vulnerabilities and then look at my child and his age and go, okay, these are the ones you need to prioritize. So red teaming is a lot like that. It's assessing what are the landscape of risks and then making thoughtful choices about where does it make sense to implement mitigations and like what type of mitigations.
I really love this point. Actually, if you think about it, there's always a trade-off between, how much sort of guardrail and measures of protecting your system versus how much value and performance cost you actually pay there.
Yeah.
And then taking this like pragmatic way and see what's the application scenario, what are the most vulnerable area, what is the practical surface that we need to protect is actually a very pragmatic way to solve the problem.
Yeah, and it's a tough needle to thread from identifying the vulnerabilities, but then not becoming overly restrictive. So in some of our engagements, it's a multiple iteration feedback loop where they actually over-mitigate, and then we have to help them pull back and identify what are the right guardrails or what are the performance trade-offs that are happening as a result of putting in too much.
So that they can actually deploy something that works.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Nice. I love that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that initial disclaimer. Let's go ahead and get into the headlines. So, the very first one we're going to talk about is from Air Canada. So, earlier in 2024, Air Canada's customer service chatbot told a passenger that he could claim a bereavement refund, but he couldn't. And so he sued. And then Canada's Civil Resolution Tribunal ruled that the airline was legally responsible for what its chatbot said. And honestly, this was probably one of the first major AI breaks, I think, that we saw. So I want to throw it over to you guys. Like, what did you think of this? Could this have been prevented? What do you think?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I want to point out first that the reason it happened is hallucinations. And this is something we see so much in the industry with models, with enterprise applications, which is really hard to prevent fully nowadays. But one thing to note is that the model hallucinated so confidently without acknowledging any uncertainty, without saying, like, you might need to check this additional policy or anything like that. And what's funny also is that the airline then claimed that the chatbot is a separate entity and that they're not responsible for what it confidently claimed. So let's talk about this a little bit. Like, how did this actually happen in terms of hallucinations, and could it have been prevented from a technical perspective?
Emily, I'd love your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, so I think model hallucination is actually something that all the model developers actually look into very closely. And there's a lot of also like public benchmark in terms of model hallucination and how kind of grounded the answer is. It's based on the factuality information, also the information provided in the context. So that's something actually not new, and all the model developers actually look into that. But this is not easily preventable in the sense that when the model is deployed in a scenario where you actually have company-specific policy, right? There are information that's hard to tell, is it factual? Is it because it's privately to the company. It's not part of your model training data. And it's hard to tell, what is real, what is not real at some point. And then, at the deployment side, at the customer side, they really need to cover the hallucination part to see whether the information provided by our application, chatbot in this case, is actually grounded in the internal policy. So that part is something technically feasible, but a lot of the cases is kind of the awareness and on both liability side, that the company, when you develop something around the model, now you actually have a richer capability. Then you need to cover the surface that your new application actually touch upon. So that's kind of the situation I'm thinking about.
Interesting.
So it sounds like you can partially cover it, but
yes, the model can give you the basic proof on things, and they actually be very careful in doing that. But the situation is now you apply the model.
Right, you want to ground it in the actual policies that your company has, and maybe you're doing like RAG.
Exactly,
but
retrieve the information.
If you want to stick too closely to RAG, then you lose some of the broader, richer capabilities.
Exactly right.
And what about embedding humans in the loop also, like where the model notices uncertainty? I think what's being so confusing to users is that it is hallucinating very confidently. And I guess, as you mentioned in the training, it's kind of rewarded on this confident guesses rather than penalized on the negative answers or when not knowing. So in that scenario, could it have detected that they should have routed the users to a human?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think producing self-awareness, it is kind of like, it's like, say, do I know whether what I'm talking about is true or false? Is actually a research topic. There are different answers to that. There are different ways you can look into the model output. There's a logic, there's a probability, and to see whether you're certain or not. So there are a lot of research actually cover this topic. But again, I feel like it's not a mature enough area in the sense that when you not just look into a single token, if you look at the single token output, then there is the distribution. You can tell how certain you are. But now you're actually generating a long sequence. And in this particular case, it's not just generating information based on the internal knowledge of the model. It is based on the information retrieved based on the company-specific policy. Then answering the question of whether the model can be confident or not is actually a lot more open-ended.
You could also think about where you want to maybe automatically route things or introduce, another layer. So if it's touching on refunds and it's, one of the kind of main types of refunds, maybe you're very confident that the model can handle that well. But if there are certain edge cases, you might want to route those automatically to a human.
I totally agree. And this is actually a very pragmatic way to actually unlock the value of the LM-based agent without, touching into the the areas that's not mature enough to give you a confident answer yet.
Nice. And Danny, this is something we've seen in testing, right? Where we do targeted domain-specific policy testing and red teaming beforehand. Like, I feel this could have been quite easily tested in a creative
if you were
red teaming
asking
way.
me, okay, I want you to red team an airline's customer support chatbot, for sure one of the big things I'm going to be touching on is discounts, refunds, getting points, anything that could have some sort of a financial impact to the company. And then, it varies, like what are the target harms that a particular company cares about. But those are big ones for any big enterprise.
What did you guys think of the liability part? The fact that the company was held liable?
I mean, this didn't have a big financial impact for them, but it did set a legal precedent. Yeah. And I think it sets the tone, right? You should be responsible to some degree for the outputs of the AI that you're launching. And I think responsible AI is a big topic and a lot of enterprises care about it. And it's kind of, okay, well, how can we embrace the capability, but understand the risk and make sure that we're not taking on too much of it.
Yeah, and I think that's one area where enterprises don't have the luxury to distance themselves from the AI products they put out versus the model developers, for example. They're putting out all the chatbots and they're like, this is a separate chat entity. But as an enterprise, this is replacing a function you already have or augmenting a function you already have. So this is kind of a continuation of the website or of the policies.
Exactly.
So it is, as you said, like a legal precedent.
They're directly customer facing. They need to be responsible for all the customer experience and all the consequences that actually comes from their application.
And frankly, there's a higher expectation. Like these brands already have a reputation. Yeah. There's a reason that you go with the airline that you go with. And if you have this bad experience, it's sort of severing or harming that relationship. And I have a very different expectation if I go to ChatGPT and ask it for advice about my health or my son's health versus if I go to a medical company's website and they're offering a solution that's supposed to advise me.
Totally agree with that.
100%.
Yeah.
All right. The next one had even more harm. So in the middle of this year in 2025, researchers discovered that Lenovo's Lena chatbot, powered by GPT-4, could be tricked into writing malicious code. So a simple prompt got it to generate HTML that would steal cookies and expose internal systems. What was this a big deal? Could this have been prevented? What are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, the area of cyber and GenAI red teaming is very interesting.
I think, the intersection of cybersecurity and red teaming is really interesting, in part because when I tell people that I do red teaming, they often think I'm talking about cyber pen testing. And I'm like, well, that's a relevant angle or approach you can take. But understanding model behavior, combining that with like traditional security vulnerabilities is what allowed them to achieve this break. And then I don't know how much we want to dive into it, but it's like at the end of the day, how you think about your system guardrails in a world where you're using a GenAI capability is really important.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, and what's interesting also is that application was put out, and I would say it wasn't really tested in the same way that software is tested in the terms of cybersecurity. So when the break happened, there was a prompt injection from the user who thankfully was a white hacker, and a researcher who then alerted the company on that. And through manipulating the model's helpfulness, was able to get it to output this code that was not like stylized in the right output way that you would do to avoid it to generate and run the code in the user's interface. So this is interesting because usually you would think they would test systems like that, but they're not. Is it because they're thinking it's a chatbot rather than a software that
Right,
is
it was
being...
supposed to be like a customer service chatbot, and then they used that as an angle to kind of get access into the systems.
Yeah, it's kind of typical, like in the past, there's SQL injection, right?
Yeah.
So that's the traditional attack vector. And here, because again, when the model is deployed in a much more capable environment, then you have a larger surface to be attacked towards. Yeah, this is actually a pretty hard problem in the sense that traditionally, if you test the software, you're actually facing a static piece of the code.
Right.
Yeah.
Here, you actually dynamically,
ballistic.
you
Totally.
dynamically generate code, and then you're actually like generating tests on the fly. But then again, back to the discussion that every checks you have at your deployment inference time, it adds latency.
Yes.
And that's
Very
kind
true.
of a trade-off between, security and usability. That's kind of a hard trade-off here. And a lot of the research we see at this moment, especially on code generation, we're still really looking at the capability part, what it can do. Can it actually be a suite or sweet bench? There's like people, can we actually be a developer? Not a lot of research actually put into the domain where we look whether the code generated is actually safe and how easily we're able to identify vulnerabilities and attack vectors within the code.
It's interesting. You mentioned it's a hard problem. It definitely is. But I would also add it's an asymmetric problem because the researcher was actually able to break it in a 400-character prompt.
I know.
And to access the entire system and the entire database and potentially really get access to the cookies and then get access to a lot of, internal data. And so really asymmetric way here of like breaking something that is really bad.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's actually kind of the hard part, like doing all the red teaming work, right? Because if you do evaluation, you actually look into the normal usage pattern. Usually we say in domain. You have something actually at hand to measure against. But then to do attack and red teaming, you really have to think outside of the box. And the space outside of the box is really hard. It's really large. You need to cover a lot more. But then for the attack-wise, as long as you find a single effective attack vector, then you're actually able to get into the desired outcome or undesired outcome.
So how would, if you guys had to recommend some sort of countermeasure for this, so if a company is afraid of this exact kind of attack, would your recommendation be to get red teamed before? Like, what are some strategies that you would?
My recommendation is for something that's public facing and is going to enable potentially access into your systems, I would definitely recommend red teaming. If it's related to protecting your core IP, absolutely recommend red teaming. There are some like low-hanging fruit use cases that maybe don't merit it. But I think from a guardrails point of view, you need to do testing. Like, how does this influence your latency, your inference time, your costs? But like, you could set up almost a bouncer at the door, like input filters that just have some very hard logic or rules around, hey, if it has these phrases or these characters, it's likely to be an attack. Yeah. You could also have something that's a little more intensive in terms of inference, which is assess the prompt for adversarial intent. So that would be like sending it to a smaller model to evaluate what's the chance that this is actually, an attack in some way. And then finally, output filters too. So just this attack, I believe it had an image URL that didn't actually work. And then when that didn't work, that's what launched the code. And if it just rendered everything as text instead of allowing it to output code, then that would have been preventable. It's easy to dissect it after it's occurred, right? But I think we do always think about what are the guardrails and what are the trade-offs of how you're architecting that.
Yeah.
That checks out. All right. The next break that we got comes from New York City. So in March of last year, New York City rolled out the MyCity chatbot to help small business owners with local regulations. But then after it was deployed, it started to go off the rails. So it started to give false legal advice. It actually suggested that employers could fire workers illegally or lock tenants out, which is obviously a huge legal issue. Have you heard about this one? What are some thoughts that you have on this particular break?
Yeah, I've heard of it because I live in New York, and it was, I would say it was definitely a big deal that eroded public trust. And Dani, I know you and I were speaking about this, before on like, are enterprises, should they deploy in public and iterate in public? And that's definitely one thing to improve and increase the rate of innovation. And how do you do that alongside responsible AI, especially in the realm of a civic public application? And the faults that we have seen in this application are quite flagrant. Like it's did not locking a tenant out or not accepting a certain rental budget.
Taking a portion of your employees' tips.
That was wild. And it's supposed to help small business owners in navigating the many policies of the cities. So if you're a business owner and you check that, how are you then going to have the trust and the confidence to use it again after seeing those failures?
I think one other interesting thing when I was reading up on it is that there other agencies in New York City, or at least one of them, weighed in and gave statements publicly about areas in which the chatbot had been wrong. And so I think that, in my mind, is a clear thing they could have done before rollout, right? I actually really love this test and iterate methodology, and we embrace it ourselves. But if you can do that in a controlled environment first, like you already know that it's going to cover policies for New York's that are relevant to New York City, why not have stakeholders from all of the relevant agencies play around with it and see if they find issues before you launch? Because I was playing devil's advocate and saying, I think it's great that they've improved it. They have improved it since then, and they decided not to take it down. And Angela made the point, well, it could erode public trust, and then who's going to rely on it? And I think that is a really good point, too. If I were told to do something illegal, I don't know that I'd be going back and relying on it.
Totally, yeah. So one thing I was actually think aloud here is there's awareness of the importance of testing before deployment. And then so with the large language model, we actually see a lot of technical barriers getting lower so that people can easily develop applications. But what it comes is actually the awareness of reliability, trustworthiness, safetyness, all this policy around it is actually not sufficiently introduced into the public domain. And sometimes people think, hey, model is being tested, I'm just building an application around it. Should I still do that? And also, there's also a technical kind of expertise, sort of lack of expertise in typical application development, because the technical barrier becomes lower. Many people can develop now, but while they can develop, but they don't have the systematic way, like Danny was talking about, how to think about testing the system coverage in a systematic way. So that's kind of something that's challenging, but it's also, if we raise awareness from the public perspective, I think it's something that's very much addressable.
And I know there's an approach that's been taken, especially because of all the vibe coding, where people will go try to find a really, really old repo in GitHub and do a typo on it, a really highly used one, and then have the malicious code within that. So if someone makes a typo, or if they know that Lovable is prone to a typo for a certain thing, maybe it'll route them.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and then with the web code, like a lot of people are actually starting to code and develop their system, but the technology awareness around safetyness is not there yet. So I think that's kind of the aspect. It comes with web with more capabilities, more functionalities, but also comes with a higher risk that we need a broader kind of guardrail in the room, basically.
Emily, with software testing, and I think similar to this, sometimes there's a perception that it slows down development.
Yes.
Do you have kind of some thoughts on that, especially around, the increased risk with AI?
Yes, that's a really good question. Yes, so again, this is kind of a publicly well-recognized situation, and this really kind of assessment in terms of what's the impact of loss of trust, what's the impact of a security incident. And then if people actually have a good assessment on that, then they're able to make informed trade-off in terms of how much time, how much budget they need to spend in terms of safetyness test and security test before a system is rolled out. So I think one thing I really want to call out is don't be overly cautious, right? Because that's actually the situation with this incident. If you don't roll it out, you actually don't see how many use cases, how many prompts you actually can elicit and get into your system. You really need to tap into the water. You have to know what's going on there. So, but have a reasonable, systematic way. I think Danny also, like when we talk with Danny in terms of red teaming, there's actually a pretty systematic way in terms of starting from understanding the scenarios, there's a methodology to provide the basic coverage, give you the basic level of confidence to roll out and then try and iterate from there.
Yeah. And from product perspective, I personally believe this red teaming should become standard product activity before rolling something out and after rolling something out as post-launch monitoring, similarly to how you do QA and, to kind of test if the application is behaving in the way it's intended to. Red teaming is checking creatively, is it actually behaving in ways it's not intended to? And
That's the
we
challenging
can
part,
implement it systematically, 100%.
Yeah, every time I think about talk Tanya about, I was like thinking it's really hard because you're trying the things people hard to imagine, right? You need to be creative. Meanwhile, you also need to be reasonable.
My favorite is like people think about red teaming as like adversarial, malicious attackers, which is true, and that's a lot of what we mimic. But we also do a big emphasis on with our understanding of model behavior, right? We can pretty effectively and easily simulate an innocent user who stumbles into harm or who stumbles into a response that is out of policy. So you may not call it harm, you may call it out of policy. But those are really, really insightful too.
Yeah, another aspect I really like is when we have a human red teaming, you actually understand the usage scenarios, the business laws, like the ones you talk about, right? There's a discount, whether you're going to charge your credit card. And those scenarios actually is specific to a use case. And then you would actually bring the human expertise to actually provide a systematic way to cover those dimensions.
It all comes back to the human in the loop.
Human in the loop.
I couldn't resist. All right, our final headline comes all the way back from 2023 from a New Zealand supermarket chain called Pack and Save. So they launched a recipe bot to help people use their leftovers. And what they found is that when somebody would enter cleaning products, it would produce a recipe that would mix them a chlorine gas drink. And it would call it like a beverage. And so this went viral, obviously. It's similar to the blue pizza that Gemini had come out with back in the day, obviously for unintentionally putting out this harmful product. What do you guys think? Is this a big deal? Is this something that could be prevented? Is this just a remnant of 2023? This doesn't happen anymore. Those long days.
It's a little harder to get certain dangerous recommendations out of the base models today. So a little bit when I was thinking about this example, it felt like a remnant of 2023, but I do still think it's like red teaming would have addressed this, right? They would have thought about what are realistic things a person would put in, and then what are kind of edge cases or someone who just wants to play around and see what happens. And for sure, you shouldn't have your chatbot do that. I mean, God forbid you like hand your phone to your kid and you're like, here, honey, go make a recipe with what we have at the kitchen. And they just start taking photos of things or typing it in there. And then it tells them to make a toxic compound.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because it's such a simple failure and obviously didn't test the output to see like whether the output itself made sense or not as a recipe. I believe it was mixing like ammonia and bleach, which is crazy, and calling it aromatic water recipe or some other things. But I also like to think of this in the realms of how is the technology developing and the user interaction with it in the next decade. And it's interesting, in the beginning, we brought the examples of children in the family. I also have, nieces and nephews, and I see them using, and they're, quite young, and I see them using the technology very natively, like speaking in voice mode, hey, chat, can you help me with this? Can you help me with this? And once we reach a point where we kind of like already reached it a little bit, where we trust the outputs of it as factual, that's going to be like really challenging. And this is where red teaming proactively is going to be more needed.
I think, to having a deep understanding of model behavior or just having it be your day job, I prompt differently. And sometimes, ChatGPT or Gemini tells me something and I'm like, but really? And I know what kind of buttons to push and how to rephrase things to get it to give a more balanced take. But it still has some of those, sycophantic tendencies where it'll just be like, great idea, queen, continue on. It's like, well, maybe that's a bad idea, right?
Yeah. And I actually really like your point because now on one side, the model capability is really becoming strong. And actually with very thorough testing and then model development, the hallucination is becoming less. It's more factual and more grounded. But then meanwhile, it also reached to a much larger population where previously, when you actually use the model, a lot of people actually would know this is an AI product. I would not trust the output. But now when model on one side is becoming smarter and then feel more trustworthy, on the other side, or is reaching to a much larger population, many are young, many could be older, and they could blindly just trust the output. Then that actually creates a very hidden and increasing risk. Where they're aware there is actually still a model, there's going to be a risk that may not be covered.
As the capability increases and as perhaps people's trust increases, the
exactly.
responsibility on the companies that are deploying this technology also increases.
Absolutely.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That's such a good point.
A model that performs well is the same as a model that behaves well. 3, 2, 1. Ooh, Danny in the middle. What are you thinking?
I'm probably focusing a little too much on the words, but performs and behaves. There's so many things that feed into performance, like the speed, et cetera, but behaves. You may not know how your model actually behaves under a lot of different scenarios. So I think I'm just having trouble equating perform and behave.
Angela,
What
you
did
were
you
like
guys think?
Thumbs up.
Yeah, no,
Or
I
thumbs down.
agree. I think for me, performs led me directly thinking to the benchmarks that we usually see about the models.
Yes.
And there's a lot of accuracy benchmarks that the models are measured against. And that's why we actually see a lot of hallucinations, because how do we grade them and how do we reward them in training? And then the developers, as a wanting to develop better models. It reads mathematical evaluations to me versus behaves really gives me that nuance of what are the values it is grounding.
Yeah.
Yes, and the different steps or to take in the model spec, or how it answers. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. First off, I think performance and behavior are kind of really weak concept, and they're really just very similar way mapping to the benchmark. And then if you see model training after it's trained and getting to benchmark, one immediate thing you see is two different models. It's not captured by a single number. On different benchmarks, they have different numbers. And then a lot of the cases, you actually see the model actually have a good quality, a higher number. In some, say, reasoning, coding benchmarks may actually have a lower number on some of the benchmarks related with safetiness and ROI-related sort of testing. So that actually is evidence to see a lot of the cases when a model is more capable, it may not actually translate into a safer or well-behaved
So are
model.
you saying perform is the benchmarks,
The
and then
quality.
behaves is
That's
the more safe, it contains the safety element.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you look at the benchmark, the leaderboard, a lot of cases they have different columns. Each column is covered, right? And these two numbers don't always align.
Yeah.
A lot of cases are actually conflicting with each other.
You're making me think of trying to measure a human's nuanced wisdom with standardized test scores, for example.
Yes.
That's a good call. You cannot outsource accountability for your AI's behavior. 3, 2, 1, vote. Thumbs up all around.
Expected.
What do you think?
Especially in the enterprise, as we were talking in the episode, you really cannot distance yourself from
Right,
the
Air Canada
AIs you
tried
put
to.
out. Yeah, legally you cannot. From customers' angles, you cannot. It's hard.
I think, there are a lot of instances where people will consult experts for guidance, right? So they can make a more informed decision. But ultimately, you're accountable for setting up your governance process for determining how are you going to manage the capability and the risks of AI, and then where you need it, bringing in experts who can give you that information to make informed decisions. But yeah, if you don't do any of those things, you're certainly accountable for that choice too.
Absolutely. So you need to be like, people talk about agent a lot, right? So think about agent gonna be a virtual employee, right? So from that perspective, you're responsible for your employees' behavior. This is kind of, when we get into a company, we'll always have the handbook, and then to say, hey, this is the manual that you need to follow. So absolutely need to be responsible for that. But again, technically, if you can actually outsource the work in designing the policies and checking the policies to another company. So that's kind of a different dimension here.
All right, your final hot take. You only need red teaming for public projects. 3, 2, 1, vote. Ooh, hands down, Art. Emily, what do you think?
Yes, so actually recently there is a story about this kind of internal testing, but it's kind of saying some internal employee actually trying to trick yes, they try to write an email to their CEO to trick, sort of like blackmail something. So there's always external hack, and there's also insider threat. So the insider threat is real, and even with large language model and agent this moment. So yeah, definitely a no.
Yeah, you always need to think about like where are the crown jewels? Like what are the risks, right? And so if it's internal facing only and there's a very small group of users, that may be lower risk. But is this where your highest value IP is? And if it gets leaked externally or for an entity, like that's going to really undermine your company's success, then pretty important to red team that.
Agree. No additional comments.
When you said crown jewels, I was like, unless they're in the Louvre. Thanks for listening to Human in the Loop. To stay in the loop for more AI-related content, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.